Welcome to Module 1, Inventing Ohio. Our goal for this module is to discover an unfamiliar place, an Ohio one step removed from its recognizable boundaries, its familiar cities and towns, its standard collection of heroes and villains. Try to think of Ohio as an invention, a tool to allow people to access the ideas and the goods of the wider world. The story of Module 1 is the story of the best and the worst that humans can do to one another. Our story begins with the Hopewell culture. The Hopewell were an innovative, sophisticated, and prosperous culture, built not by one tribe, but a collection of tribes. And despite their differences, these tribes held one thing in common. They were engineers. They built mounds. They weren't the first mound builders, but I think they were the best mound builders. They specialized in geometric shapes, circles and squares and octagons with parallel lines connecting these different shapes into a coherent complex. They emerged around 200 BC and started to die out around 400 AD. And the place that we call Ohio was the epicenter of this culture. Though this map shows that the culture spread throughout the Great Lakes region and the Ohio and Mississippi valleys. We should also note at this point that we don't know what these Indians called themselves. We use the name Hopewell only because artifacts relating to this culture were found in the late 19th century on a farm owned by a man whose last name was Hopewell. And we can't even use the term Ohio to describe the place where these Hopewell Indians lived. That's an invention of a later day. So how did this work? How did the Hopewell spread their influence throughout this map? Well, the answer is the Hopewell Interaction Sphere. Here's a good basic definition of the Hopewell Interaction Sphere. A decentralized power structure that organizes distinct, diverse, and far-flung groups into a coherent system of cultural, material, and technological exchange. How should we think about this? It helps to contrast the interaction sphere with an empire. Pick any empire in the history of the world. In most empires, you see a large-scale military. You see a bureaucracy collecting and spending taxes. You see a powerful leader guiding the agenda of this empire. The empire seeks to impose its will on people. But the interaction sphere had none of that. They spread their influence, they spread their prosperity by enticing people rather than coercing them. So let's break down this Hopewell interaction sphere into its main elements and see how these different elements work together. Our first element is the Mississippi River system. Remember, at this time, 2,000 years ago, there are no cars, there are no planes, there aren't even horses in North America. To travel, you went by foot or you went by water. And remember, too, that the Hopewell interaction sphere had as its goal to spread prosperity, to spread ideas, to entice people to join in this collection of tribes and enrich each other's life. To do that, you have to travel. So water is the first main element of the Hopewell interaction sphere. So water routes facilitated our next main element, exchange. Take a look at this map and note three important points. First, the trading network represented here nearly matches the Mississippi River system that we showed you in the previous slide. That's not a coincidence. Second, note that the items shown here are generally not found in Ohio. And third, note that these items are luxuries, not necessities. This means that the Hopewell had a decision to make. Do we want to be self-sufficient? They could have protected themselves, they could have fed themselves without ever engaging the wider world, without ever taking the risk of talking to someone who didn't think like they did, who didn't look like they did, who lived in an entirely different place than they did. They decided instead that they would be better off in dealing with strangers. But that meant having to offer something to these strangers, of saying to these strangers, here's what we do really well. Can you give us something that you do really well in exchange for what we do really well? That's called mutually beneficial specialization. This idea should sound familiar to you. This map shows where Apple gets its supplies as it makes its phone and its computers. Compare this map to the Hopewell Trading Network map that we showed on a previous slide. Yes, the global network you see here today is bigger than the continental network that the Hopewell culture created 2,000 years ago, but the principle is the same. Both you today and the Hopewell 2,000 years ago decided to take a risk. Find out how strangers can enrich your life. Today, we rely on large centralized organizations to make that process work. Private companies, national governments, international trade organizations, and yes, the U.S. military always has a presence around the world. But 2,000 years ago, based out of the place that we call Ohio, the Hopewell managed this complicated process without large-scale coercive institutions. And they did so to acquire exotic materials not normally found in the place that we call Ohio. Take, for example, mica from western North Carolina, a brittle, fragile mineral that's not any good for making tools. It does, however, lend itself very well to delicate arts and crafts. Or consider this copper mask, probably the only representation we have of an Indian living under the Hopewell culture 2,000 years ago. How did they acquire these exotic materials? What did they specialize in to get these special materials? Technology. And by technology, I mean quite literally mounds of dirt. Consider this artist's rendering of the Newark earthworks, perhaps the most significant of all the Hopewell mounds. This complex is located in Newark, Ohio, near the OSU branch campus. Now, not all of the complex exists today, mainly the circle and octagon that you see in the foreground and the great circle that you see in the back right. But the scale of this complex, as we have reconstructed it, makes the wonders of the ancient world pale in comparison. Consider the Giza pyramid. Just one of those fits in that small square that you see in the background. 4 Colosseums in Rome fit into the octagon. 1 Stonehenge fits nicely into that small circular enclosure next to the octagon. The scale is remarkable precisely because the Hopewell had no urban center. There was no density of population. And they were a non-hierarchical society. So where did the labor come from? Who decided who did what and when and for how long? We have no idea. But we do know this complex was precisely designed. For example, from the center of the observatory circle in the foreground to the center of the great circle in the background on the right, that distance is precisely 6 times the diameter of the observatory circle. And from the center of the octagon to the center of the square in the background, that distance is also 6 times the diameter of the observatory circle. We also believe that this enclosure acted as a road. We call it the Great Hopewell Road. Most of it doesn't exist anymore, but from what we can reconstruct, it stretched approximately 60 miles to Chillicothe along the Scioto River. And it ends in yet another observatory circle and yet another octagon mound. These geometric shapes are nearly identical. The major difference is that the Chillicothe mounds are oriented at precisely 90 degrees to that of the Newark mounds, suggesting a special relationship between these two places and these sets of mounds. I've only scratched the surface of the intricate geometry and remarkable scale of the Newark earthworks. But it's time now to answer 2 pressing and related questions. What does any of this have to do with technology? And what role did these mounds play in the Hopewell Interaction Sphere? Let's consider technology first. These piles of dirt are, in reality, a lunar observatory, tracking the moon across the sky throughout its 18.5-year cycle. The moon, at key moments in its journey, lines up with openings in the octagon. When the moon hits its most northerly extreme point, it lines up directly with the center of the octagon and the observatory circle. That's no easy feat. Scientists will tell you that tracking the motions of the moon are notoriously difficult. Indeed, Sir Isaac Newton, you know him, there he is, credited with inventing calculus and discovering the laws of gravity. Well, he was the most brilliant mind in Western history, perhaps. And he said that making these calculations gave him a headache. So use your imagination. You see here a static artist's rendering. But I would like you to see a machine with gears that move, with pieces that need to be invented, made to work with other pieces, put together and maintained. A modern piece of technology that might run in any factory today. So what are the pieces and how are they moving? Well, first, the water. The entire complex was built around a large pond, back and to the right on your screen, while streams form the northern, eastern, and southern boundaries of the site. So certainly the movement is in the water itself and the people using water as access points. But the way the water frames the ritual spaces suggests a symbolic and not merely a practical relationship between water and the mounds. Second, consider the moving piece of the moon, connecting at crucial moments with the octagon's alignments. And for the final piece, consider the mounds themselves. They seem stationary, but consider the movement necessary to dig the dirt, to carry it to the site, and to shape it. The movement of construction, in other words. Or consider the movement in the Hopewell Road, connecting the site with another site 60 miles to the south, the Chillicothe. The site and the Chillicothe Mounds work together. They are pieces of the same machine documenting the moon's journey. But the Newark earthworks are more than just precisely functioning pieces of technology. We might consider the possibility, not the certainty, but the possibility that these are in fact monumental machines. Machines, that is, that take on both a productive technological quality as well as a communal spiritual quality. Now, the Eastern Woodland Indians believe that there are three worlds in their universe. A watery underworld, here represented by the streams surrounding the earthworks and the pond in the background on the right. A middle world of soil and stone, represented, of course, by the mounds themselves. And an upper world of the sky, thus the importance of the lunar observatory. And it's possible, again, we're not certain, but it's possible that this earthwork complex gathered the energies of these three worlds so that a visitor could experience them, feel them, be transformed by them in rituals involving communities, in feasts, in celebrations. It's possible, in other words, that the Newark earthworks combine both science and spirituality in a search for meaning. The meaning of life, the meaning of community, the meaning of the universe. So a large-scale, complex machine designed to explore the nature of the universe and the human place within it. A piece of technology, in other words, with spiritual implications. How strange, yes? I mean, what good is the technology if we can't watch videos of cats playing the piano? Of course, the Newark earthworks are not at all strange. We have similar machines serving the same purpose today. Consider, for example, the Large Hadron Collider. It is the world's largest machine, all underground, about 100 miles underground at its deepest point. As you see on the screen, the Large Hadron Collider straddles the border of France and Switzerland. At its most basic description, the Large Hadron Collider is a tube 16.8 miles around, and protons move around this tube at the speed of light in opposite directions, and then they collide. The results of the collision, the bang, are then analyzed. So we're using the basic building blocks of nature, gathering their kinetic energies together. It took engineers, scientists, and technicians decades to build this machine. Their goal? To explore the origins of the universe, to figure out the basic laws of nature. and how humans fit in, just like the people of the Hopewell culture 2,000 years ago. So you're now looking at the remains of the Newark earthworks. You can see, if you look closely, the observatory circle and the octagon. Off in the distance is the Great Circle. That's what largely remains of the Great Newark earthworks. But I also think that you are looking at what the Hopewell culture specialized in, what they did so well in order to entice strangers to trade exotic materials with them. A scientific religious experience, a transformative event that bound diverse people together. The Hopewell were building something far more interesting than a trade network. If all they wanted was an economic exchange, then the people who brought these exotic materials to this place that we call Ohio would never have shown up. For example, to get your phone, you don't need to go to China. The phone comes to you via several shippers: trains, container ships, trucks. And again, we have large-scale centralized organizations that act as an intermediary, handling all those logistics for you. But we see none of that in the Hopewell period. No trade hubs where the exotic item is transferred from one shipper to another, and certainly no large-scale organization serving as an intermediary. So the people who brought these materials, these long distances, they're really pilgrims, travelers in search of an experience, of an idea that they can take home with them. Beyond a lunar observatory, beyond scientific knowledge and engineering skill, beyond even a spiritual experience, what were the Hopewell producing with this monumental machine? In reaching out to strangers, to people who were fundamentally unlike them, the Hopewell risked their lives in order to enrich their culture. They encouraged traveling. They encouraged immigration. They understood how long-distance alliances with strangers was mutually beneficial. So they took a chance. Their monumental machinery helped them to build social cohesion in a dangerous world. In fact, they sought cultural complexity and interconnectedness when isolation and simplicity would have sufficed. How long could they sustain that choice?